I'd like to talk a little bit about story structure, and especially about how we can try to get away from the way you might be used to look at story structure, which is what I call the logistical three-act structure. So let's take a brief look at that. The structure you might be used to is this one. If you look at the bottom on the red one, it's the way Sitfield defined it 30 years ago. This idea that you had to have 3 acts in every story. They had to be 30, 60, and 30 minutes long or pages long. Nowadays, it's more 25, 50, 25 because the average size of a script or of a film has shrunk. But the principle is the same. The idea that you define acts by number of pages or by number of minutes. That's the way the three-act structure is being taught, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. It's quite recent. It's been the case for the last 30 years, but it's not always been like that. And even if we used to think logistically, even if you go back to Shakespeare, for example, if you think about a Shakespeare play, you would think it's in 5 acts, right? These are 5 logistical acts. It's just the play is cut into chunks, and the logistical is because you needed to, you had candles lighting the scenes, you needed to change the candles every so often because they couldn't be too long or they would burn the robes of the actors, and if they were too short, you would have to change them more often. It's logistical, okay? You just have to change the candles at a regular interval. And that's why you have 5 acts in Shakespeare play, if you look logistically. But structurally, if they use, and most of them do, if they use the three-act structure, they are structured in 3 dramatic acts. And this is what's at the top, and that's what I find much more interesting as a writer, because it's much more flexible. And that's one of the key points that I want to go through regarding story structure. It's the fact that story structure is much more flexible than thinking in an amount of pages or minutes. I found that useful to, when you begin, it helps you to write a script, because it breaks a long thing and quite difficult thing to write, which is a screenplay, into more manageable chunks. But it is very prescriptive. It tells you that you have to have these acts of a specific length. If you look at the dramatic three-act structure, the justification for it is simply that if you have a main dramatic action in a story, a character who wants to achieve something and is trying to reach that goal over most of the film, then you have what happens before the action, which is everything that happens before we understand who wants what and why in the story. Then once we understand that, which is usually triggered by an inciting incident, but it can also be triggered by an inciting action. We'll see an example of that later. When that happens, when we understand who wants what and why, then we enter a dramatic act 2, which is the dramatic action, okay? Watching a character or a group of characters trying to reach the same goal. And they try to do that over most of the film, not over 50 minutes or 60 minutes. They try to do that over most of the film up to a climax, a dramatic climax, which is when you give an answer to the dramatic question you've raised when you started it here. As soon as you show a dramatic action, the question that the audience is going to ask themselves is, will the protagonist reach the goal or not? Okay, that's a dramatic question. At the climax, you give an answer to that question. You say, yes, the protagonist reaches the goal, or no, the protagonist doesn't reach the goal. That's the climax, and then you have an act 3, which is usually very short, only a few minutes, where you show the consequences of this dramatic action. What happens in the world of the protagonist once that they've spent quite a long time trying to reach a goal. There are usually consequences. This is what I call the dramatic three-act structure. The great advantage of doing it that way is first that it's very flexible. Usually, first act is 5 to 15 minutes, much shorter than 30. And the third act is very short, but it can be longer if you need to. What becomes a problem if you look at it that way is what you do with the long act 2 if it's most of the film. And that's where this logistical thing is kind of useful. And that's why Sitfield, for example, came up with the idea of a midpoint at the middle of each script. And that's why some more recent theoreticians say, well, actually, 3 acts is not enough, even with a midpoint which gives us 4 parts of equal length. So let's say 5 acts, or let's say 7 acts. 7 acts, for example, when you say that a TV movie is 7 acts, it's a 7-act structure and not a 3-act structure, it's still logistical. It's because you have 6 commercial breaks. When you say that a TV episode, a 1-hour TV episode, is 4 acts or 5 acts. Again, it's logistical. It's because you need 3 or 4 commercial breaks in it, depending on the show and where it's aired and so on. So you have to, as writers, make the difference between the logistical acts that sometimes you have to follow. For example, if you write a TV episode, you do have to make sure that at the end of every act of 15 minutes or 13 minutes or whatever they are, you will have a cliffhanger to make sure that people come back after the commercial breaks. It's part of what you have to do. So you integrate the logistical structure that you have to fulfill as a writer, but you know in your head that, okay, logistically, I'm supposed to write in 5 acts, but structurally, I still very often have just one main dramatic action. My main plot starts, Act 2 starts quite early, probably before the end of the first logistical act, and so on. I don't have time to develop that, but I will give you some notes in the online documentation that go into that in much more detail. Now, the reason why, as I said, this can be a problem is that if you follow the dramatic track structure instead of the logistical one, you end up with an Act 2, which is most of the film. Okay, so how do you break down that Act 2, which is quite a lot? And that's the second really exciting point about the dramatic track structure. It's that it has a fractal aspect. You can use the track structure to design sequences in Act 2 so that you have smaller chunks of dramatic action. Usually there are sub-goals, so you have a main goal over the whole film, and you have sub-goals, which are ways for the protagonist to reach the goal. And this is key in a thriller, because it's by designing these dramatic sequences, which are ways for the protagonist to reach the main goal, that you're going to get pace, because you're going to be able to develop some smaller actions, which are smaller dramatic actions than the main dramatic action, but they are connected to it, and there are ways to try to move the action forward. Does that make sense? And that's how you break this second act 2. Instead of saying you have to have a mid-act climax, page 60 or page 50 or whatever, you have to have 3, 5, 7 acts, which are always logistical, because they always tell you it's by that page number that you have to have a special plot point or whatever. Then you forget about that and you think dramatically. Dramatic sequences. They don't have to be the same number in every story. You can have 2 dramatic sequences in Act 1, 5 in Act 2, and 1 or 2 in Act 3 if you need to, or you can have a very short Act 3. You do whatever you want for each story. You're the master of the structure of your story if you use the dramatic structure. So we'll see how we design these sequences in a minute, but that's one of the key things about dramatic structure versus logistical structure. And of course, each sequence can be structured using the same dramatic tool, which is the dramatic track structure. Each sequence can use the dramatic track structure to structure 6 minutes, 7 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes of your story. And then each scene itself in the sequence can be structured in 3 acts as well. You just have to define who wants what and why in each scene. And that's going to give you a lot of drive as you write as a writer. If you clarify that for yourself, most writers do it unconsciously. But when you're stuck in a scene, when you feel nothing happens, I don't know why they're there, where you don't know, usually it's because you've not defined what's at stake in the scene. You don't know who wants what and why in the scene. So shifting from the logistical track structure, which only helps you by cutting chunks, making smaller chunks in the whole script, shifting from that logistical track structure to a dramatic one allows you to design, if you want to, not only the whole film, but also its parts, whether it's sequences, scenes, subplots, or strands. I would like to give you an example of this fractal aspect of the track structure, the dramatic track structure, with Misery. We're not going to watch the clip because it's 16 minutes long. We don't have the time. But I'm assuming that most of you have seen the film. If you haven't, you just run and watch it. It's a really, really good thriller. It's edgy a little bit in some ways, but from a writing point of view, you'll never see a clearer. I mean, you can actually see that in a film like Gravity, but it's one of these films where you really can see how this fractal aspect of story structure is used to design very clear sequences. So it's a very good way to analyze this fractal aspect. Now, what I'd like to do with you, I mean, as we all know, Misery is the story of Paul Sheldon, a writer who ends up being rescued by Annie Wilkes, Kathy Bates, and being trapped by her. He's a captive in her home, and gradually he realizes that his situation is quite dire and that he has to find a way to escape and survive. That's his goal over the whole film, okay? As a protagonist, he's the protagonist, she's the antagonist, do we agree on that? And his goal over the whole film is to survive and escape. Now let's see at the beginning of what I call dramatic act 2, which is about 30 or 40 minutes into the film. We have a first dramatic sequence in act 2, which is structured using the fractal aspect of the Thrax structure. So let's take a look at it. So as I said, it starts around minute 41. And it is structured in 3 acts, okay? At the beginning of that sequence, something happens, which is the inciting incident for the sequence. And it's the fact that Paul spots a hairpin on the floor, all right? That triggers his goal over the whole sequence, which is going to try to use the hairpin to escape from the house, all right? And what he does is that he has to do a few things before he can even try to get out of the house. The first thing that he has to do is he has to get Annie out of the house. That's the structure for the first scene of the sequence, okay? And he tries to do that. It's not easy. There are, there's a lot of conflict for him to try to be able to manage that because she's suspicious. He's trying to get her to buy some paper, but she doesn't understand why and so on. But he does manage to get her out. He pays a price for it. She hits him hard with a ream of paper. And then once she's out, he has the second scene in the sequence, which is about trying to get out of the room. So he uses the hairpin. He manages to open the lock with the hairpin. And that's the end of the second scene of the sequence. And then you have a third scene, which is when he tries to get out of the house. Okay, and he's blocked, the front door is blocked. He's trying to get into different rooms. The phone line is cut. And in the end, he gets in the kitchen and the back door is locked as well. So we reach a mid-act climax in the sequence, which is that he fails being able to use the hairpin to escape. But what happens is that he realizes that at that point that Annie is coming back, and then he has another goal over this scene here, scene 4, which is to find a way to get back to his room before she gets back in the house, so that she doesn't realize that he has tried to get out. This is a very suspenseful scene. You have some elements of that there because we know that she's going to town and she will be back. But from that point, you use what Hitchcock used to call the bomb under the table, which we're going to call dramatic irony, to generate suspense because it gives information to the audience, which is she's on her way back. And we know a little bit more than the protagonist from that point of view, because he doesn't know exactly where she is. We know before he does that she's coming back. And when you make the antagonist the victim of a dramatic irony, she doesn't know that he's trying to escape. Okay, we fear the consequences. We fear what's going to happen if she finds out. And we're right to fear in that case because when she finds out later in the film, she hobbles him. Okay, so what you do when you want to generate suspense in thriller, what you can do very often is make the antagonist the victim of a dramatic irony. You tell the audience something that the antagonist doesn't know. For example, the protagonist is trying to escape. We know that. The antagonist doesn't. And so we fear what's going to happen when the antagonist finds out. And that generates a lot of suspense. That's what we do in this sequence to generate suspense in that last bit. Paul manages to get back to his room before Annie's return, but then he has to prevent Annie from finding that he's been out. Because again, we fear for the consequences for that. And that's a very short scene at the end of the sequence. And then the answer is yes, he does manage to prevent her. And then we have a very short act 3. So overall, we have a sequence which is 3 scenes where he tries to use the hairpin to escape. Mid-act climax, he fails. He doesn't manage to escape with the hairpin. And then you have a second half of Act 2 of the sequence, which is when he tries to go back to his room and prevent Annie from finding out. And that answer is yes, he does manage to prevent that. Does that make sense? So that's how you use the fractal aspect of the Thrax structure to design not only the whole film, because you can, but you don't have to. We'll talk about that in a minute. I mean, you kind of have in a thriller, but in some other kind of stories, you don't have to use the Thrax structure to structure the whole film. And how you structure scenes and sequences using it thanks to its fractal aspect. It's a key element to generate pace in your thrillers. If you want pace, you have to use that you don't have to structure every scene with the Thrax structure, the dramatic Thrax structure, but you have to define what's at stake in each scene, what's at stake in each sequence, that we fear a negative outcome if the protagonist fails. That's how you're going to generate a lot of pace and anticipation. Now, I would like, that was the second point, story structure is flexible. Now, what I'd like to talk about is the difference between a plot-led and a character-led story. And plot-led doesn't mean with a strong plot. Character-led doesn't mean with strong characters. We're going to define that more clearly in a minute. But in a plot-led movie, what ties the story together is the dramatic action of the protagonist, defined by a clear conscious want. The main problem lies outside of the protagonist. That's what makes it plot-led. The main problem in the story lies in other characters, antagonistic characters, or in nature. In disaster movies, for example, are almost always using nature as an antagonist. It's antagonistic forces which cause problems in the story. But in a plot-led movie, the main problem in the story lies outside of the protagonist. In a character-led story, it's the opposite. What ties the story together is the evolution of the protagonist. And it's defined by an unconscious need, a need to change. Because the main problem in a character-led story is within the protagonist. Okay, there is a problem within the protagonist, and that defines a need to change for that character. And that's it's this evolution that's going to define the main dramatic backbone of the story. With thrillers, we are almost always dealing with either plot-led stories or exceptions, which we'll get to in a minute. It's very difficult to make a thriller with a character-led story, because how would you have a protagonist fight against themselves in a thriller? I mean, I found one in Falling Down with Michael Douglas. That's a kind of character-led thriller. Maybe The Girl on the Train would be character-led as well, because for a while we think that she might be the main problem. We don't know whether she's the murderer or not, and so on. But these tend to be close to exception. They usually use co-protagonist or a subplot which become the main plot, and so on. So most of the time with thrillers, you're dealing with a plot-led story because the antagonist is outside of the protagonist. Yeah.
Is that what you'd call psychological thriller?
Psychological thriller is when the threat is more psychological than physical. It's not necessarily, again, most thrillers are plot-led. But you have like 20 sub-genres with thrillers, so we won't get into that. But no, psychological thriller for me is when, like Misery is a psychological thriller, because in many ways it's about her playing with his mind, and he has to defeat her as well psychologically and manipulate her in many ways. There is a physical threat. There is almost always a physical threat in thriller. It's almost always about survival, as we'll see. But that's what I would call a psychological thriller. Now, in a theme-led movie, which is the last of the three main story types, what ties the story together is a unique theme, which explores a problem that usually lies in society, and it's very often a moral, spiritual, or philosophical issue. For example, if we talk about thrillers, an example of that would be Traffic. Okay, it's about the drug problem in society, how it threatens to destroy Occidental societies, and what that usually does when the theme is that strong in a story, it splits the plot. And you end up with a multi-stranded narrative, because you're trying to show that it's not just the story of one character, it's in society. So to show that, you use different strands. That's what you do in Crash, you do that in Magnolia, and you do that in quite a few thrillers, especially in TV. For example, Traffic, the Soderbergh's movie, was an adaptation from a UK TV series called Traffic. And very often in TV, you're going to use a theme-led structure, where you're going to follow different strands, different subplots, and you won't have a main plot. That's what I call a theme-led story. It's when the theme is so strong in the story that it splits the plot and makes it multi-stranded, makes it a multi-stranded narrative, whether it's a feature film or a TV series. There is no three-act structure over the whole story when you have a theme-led story. If you take Traffic, for example, you don't have a three-act structure over the whole film, because you don't have a main dramatic action. You have three main dramatic actions. You have three different strands in Traffic. So because you don't have one main dramatic action or one main dramatic evolution, you don't have a through act structure over the whole film. You can always find a logistical one. Anyone will be able to tell you, well, look, it's very simple. You have 3 logistical acts, or 5 logistical acts, or 7, or 18, or how many they want to. But from my point of view, because there is not one main dramatic action, which is the only way to justify a dramatic through act structure, you don't have one. But what you do have is you are able to structure, so there is no main protagonist because the story is multi-stranded, but each strand can be structured as plot-led or character-led, because you can have a main dramatic action or a main dramatic evolution in each strand. And again, that's the great plus about the dramatic through act structure, is that one, it doesn't tell you how many pages or how many minutes you have to have for each act, but also you can use that tool, that structural tool, to structure and design each strand, okay? So you don't have a classical through act structure over the whole story when it's multi-stranded, when it's a theme-led story, but you can use one over each strand. The fifth point about story structure is that story structure uses other tools, other structural tools, such as dramatic irony, which we're going to discuss quite a lot. And these tools are part of structure. If you don't understand dramatic irony, if you don't understand managing information and how it can be structural, then you're missing a really big part of story structure. And that's what I'm going to discuss a little bit more today. If we look in this list of films which do use dramatic irony in a structural way, if we take The Departed, for example, the remake of Infernal Affairs, we know in The Departed that the cop is a gangster and the gangster is a cop. Okay, it's 2 dramatic ironies which feed each other. They are the main dramatic backbone of that story. If you miss that, you miss the most important point in the way it's designed. If you look at The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, it's also Curtis Hanson. It's also it's an exception structurally, and it's also completely based on dramatic irony. We know that the babysitter who is hired by a family does actually want revenge for the death of her husband who committed suicide, because she thinks of the wife, the mother in the family. So they don't know that. They hire this woman, and they don't know that that she wants revenge and that she's the threat. Okay, it's a huge dramatic irony. It shapes the whole film. All right, that's a very important structural tool used in The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Another film, it's a drama, but it's also a thriller in many ways, The Lives of Others. In The Lives of Others, it's completely based on dramatic irony. We know that a Stasi officer is spying upon the couple, the writer and his girlfriend, the actress. They don't know that, and that leads us to land them a lot of conflict, because we know they're being spied upon and they don't know that. That's what makes them protagonists, okay? Because they are the characters who experience the most of conflict in the first part of the story because of what we know, not because they're trying to reach a goal and experience conflict on that road. Does that make sense? So it's really important to understand dramatic irony as a structural tool. If I look at the way I define structure, for me, the 3 main elements of structure are plot, character, and theme. But where it becomes interesting is that depending on where you put the emphasis, that's when you end up with one story type or the other. So if you put the emphasis on plot, which is led by the conscious want of the protagonist, then you have a dramatic. It's action-led. It's plot-led, but it's also dramatic. It's led by the dramatic action in the story. It's a dramatic action that shapes the structure. If you put the emphasis on the character, and especially on the unconscious need of the character to change, as we have in a character-led story, then what shapes the story, what shapes the structure, is the evolution of the character. And if most of the emphasis is on theme, which is what it is about, then you end up with a vision-led story where the filmmaker is trying to express his vision or her vision on society. And it doesn't mean that, most great films have strong plots, strong characters, strong theme. So it's not about is any of these strong, it's about where is the main problem in the story. Is the main problem within the character? Is the protagonist the antagonist, their own antagonist, character-led? Is the antagonist outside of the protagonist? Does most of the conflict come from other characters or antagonistic forces? Then you have plot-led. And if the main problem is in society, And if it ends up being a multi-stranded narrative, then you usually end up with a theme-led story. Now, what's crucial in this vision of structure, which, as you can see, doesn't even mention the idea of how many acts, because that's not really relevant. The thread structure is a tool, but it doesn't really define structure. At the top, you have managing conflict, which is defined by who wants or needs what and why in a story. At the bottom, you have managing information, who knows what and when. And that's the key thing in thrillers. I mean, it's key in many stories, but especially in thrillers. You want to be very careful with what you define regarding who knows what when. And when I say who knows what when, I mean what does the protagonist know, what does the audience know, what do the other characters know in the story at every time as the story moves forward. So if I try to summarize this, my way to define a good story, and of course it's subjective, but I try to say a good story is a metaphor for a problem-solving process, okay? So let's think about that main problem, and let's try to see where it lies in a thriller. If the main problem in the story lies outside the antagonist, in antagonistic characters of our natures, we're developing a plot-led story. The focus is the main action, main dramatic action. And then we can use the dramatic thread structure we've just defined to structure the whole story, but also its parts. Dramatic acts, sequences, scenes, subplots. That's what I call managing conflict. But then you can also use all these tools, dramatic irony, surprise, misery, suspense, to manage information in the story. And then you use other tools that we're not going to discuss today, planting and payoff, visual storytelling, exposition, and so on. If the main problem is within the protagonist, so the protagonist is the antagonist, you're developing a character-led story. The focus is the main evolution of the character, of the protagonist. And then you also use the dramatic structure to structure the whole thing and parts, and also all these tools. Now, where it becomes different between these two is when the main problem is in society, when you're dealing with a multi-stranded narrative because it's a theme-led story, then you only use the dramatic thread structure to design parts of the story. You don't have a main dramatic action, so you cannot use it over the whole film, but you can still use it to design dramatic sequences, scenes, and strands. And the same applies here. And when the main problem is not clear, or when you're playing with storytelling, like you're using reverse chronology, like in Memento, or you're using a time loop, like in source code, or you play with storytelling, then you're developing something else, hybrid and exception. I really don't believe that you can use the same paradigm or the same shape for every story. Every film is different, and you can make exceptions, and very often most of the films we love are successful exceptions or hybrids, hybrids using different story types. And in that case, they also only use the dramatic thread structure over parts, but not over the whole film. So that's what I call the story type method, because it's a method to try to identify which story type you're dealing with, because I believe you're going to develop your story differently depending according to its story type. I would like to start talking about Maslow, which is I don't know if you're familiar with Abraham Maslow. He defined theory of human needs, human motivation in 1943. It's been superseded in psychology by other theories, but I find it really useful, especially when you develop thrillers, because it helps to understand where your main problem should be located in the thriller. Let's go very briefly through the Maslow theory itself. It defines 5 different needs or main motivation. The lower one is physiological. So it's everything that if you don't reach that, you die. Okay, so it's about breathing, food, water, sex. You can survive if you don't have sex, but the species doesn't. Okay, so that's what it means there. Sleep, homeostasis, which is making sure that your body is in one piece and that there is nothing leaking out of it that shouldn't happen. Blood usually, or brain matters. So that's homeostasis. Excretion, that's something that should be leaking out, even if it's not very pleasant to discuss it. But these are, if you don't do any of these, or if that is compromised, you die, right? Physiological. Safety, it's about security. So security of body, employment, resources, morality, family, health, property. It's really basic things like keeping a roof over your head, protecting your family. Very basic things you try to achieve in your life so that you're safe, all right? These two layers, almost everyone in the world, irrespective of their culture, their language, anything, everyone in the world understands that. Then you have, I mean, I'm not saying that they don't understand that as well, but it's a very universal need, the need for safety and staying alive. Then you have love belonging, which is friendship, family, sexual intimacy. The idea of Maslow is that before you can think about these things, you have to have achieved this. Okay, so you have to be alive to be able to protect your family and make sure that you have a job and a roof over your head. And once you have this, then you can concentrate a bit more on friendship and family and sexual intimacy. And then when you have that, you can think about esteem, which is, you know, confidence, respect of others, respect by others, achievement. And then when you have all that, you can think about self-actualization, which is morality, creativity, spontaneity, problem solving, lack of prejudice, acceptance of facts. Of course, us writers, that's completely wrong, because if we waited to have all these satisfied before we write, we wouldn't write very often, right? So the idea is that that's only because we're stupid enough to associate creativity with safety of you know, resources and employment. So it's because of that that we can do this without having all these satisfied. But for a normal person, i.e. not a writer, that doesn't happen. So that's Maslow theory. What's really interesting is that it's supposed to be developmental. So you're supposed, you know, when you're a baby, you don't think about sex, but you know, you're mainly preoccupied with you know, things which are about staying alive. I'm not sure that you understand that when you're a baby, but your parents understand that. But as you grow up, you start to be more open with these things. So supposedly, when you're more evolved or older, you are more open to understand these things. And when you're younger, you're more into these lower layers. And it also, well, we're going to move on to the next slide, which is more interesting, which is what it helps us to do is it helps us to think about our genre, and we're talking about thrillers here, so it's a very specific genre. So how do we think about genre using this Maslow thing? Think about the main problem in your story, okay? And try to identify where it lies in the pyramid. Most of the time for thrillers, the main problem lies at the bottom of the pyramid, okay? It's about survival. It's about security of body, of employment, health. It's about staying alive. It's about, you know, gravity. It's about breathing. It's very primal. The lower you go, the more primal it gets. But thrillers and horror tend to hover in this area. Of course, you can explore other layers. For example, gravity is all about staying alive and about breathing, but the theme is about resilience. It's about rebirth, so it goes quite high. And she's also trying to acceptance of fact. She's trying to move on from the death of her daughter. So it's also about family. So you can explore other subplots or other elements in the theme, but you try to have your main problem located at the bottom of the pyramid in a thriller. It also has very interesting elements regarding the audience that you can try to reach, because usually the lower you are in the pyramid, the wider your audience is. This is why thrillers can be very mainstream, okay? It's because they are about survival, they're about protecting your family, they're about very universal themes, and these themes talk to everyone in the world. Again, they travel. They tend to travel very well. Very often they're visual, not many subtitles. Very often, if you think about a thriller like Misery, they're also very contained, and that's where you want to be as a newcomer. You want to try to come up with a thriller which is very contained, so very low budget, below the line. I mean, they had a high budget, I mean, not a very high budget, but they had a higher budget because of the cast. But if you think about the below the line budget in Misery, it's very low. So you have a contained thriller. It doesn't cost much, but potentially it can reach a really wide audience. That's what producers want, okay? When you're a newcomer. They want something that can potentially reach a really wide audience, which thrillers can do, but they don't want it to cost too much. And you can achieve that. If you think about Misery, you can achieve that with a thriller. So that's the target audience. And lastly, the story type. Thrillers tend to be about survival, and that's why they mostly plot-led, as we say they're on here. Character-led is usually about understanding ourselves and others, which is not what thrillers do best, but it can happen. And so they tend to be hovering in this area. And theme-led stories, multi-stranded narratives tend to be about understanding the world, understanding society, and so on. And they tend to be, the main problems tend to be at the top of the pyramid. What you do when you have a theme-led story is you try to have subplots where the main problem explores much lower layers. That's what you do in Crash, for example. It's about lack of prejudice. It's about respect of others and by others. So it's at the top of the pyramid. It's, you know, racial tension in LA. But what you do is every single strand in Crash, in that multi-strand narrative, is going to explore things which are about security of employment, security of property, survival, and that's what makes it possible to widen the potential audience. By the way, I don't think, as you know, there is no formula for commercial success. Okay, I'm not talking about a formula. I'm talking about ideas. All of this is very rough. There is no rule to follow. I'm just trying to get you to think about where your main problem lies and which consequences it might have regarding the potential audience. I'm not talking about the audience, I'm talking about the potential audience of the film.